Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the breakout session on food and water sustainability. Over the next 90 minutes, we have a star-studded panel here who will discuss some of the biggest issues in food, water, and health affecting developing geographies and how sustainable technologies can solve some of these problems. Let me start off by introducing our moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Raj Rajan. Dr. Rajan is the Vice President of R&D and is a global sustainability leader at Ecolab. Ecolab is a $12 billion Minneapolis, Minnesota-based company, which is a global leader in water, hygiene, and energy technologies. In his current role, Dr. Rajan helps drive top-line growth for Ecolab and its customers by embedding sustainability thought leadership into the innovation process. Dr. Rajan has 29 years of experience in water cycle management and environmental process engineering for the paper, petroleum, food, beverage, and various other industries. His technical expertise covers design and implementation of water, wastewater, waste management projects, and renewable energy systems. Dr. Rajan is active in industry groups focused on developing greenhouse gas mitigation, climate change adaptation, and water stewardship documents. Dr. Rajan received his PhD in environmental engineering from University of Massachusetts and his bachelor's in civil engineering from IIT BHU Varanasi. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel and our moderator, Raj Rajan.
Thank you, Arun. How's everyone doing out there? I know I am enjoying the balmy Houston weather. I just flew in this morning from Minnesota, and there it's the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales are about to clash. It was almost 40 degrees below zero this morning. So I'm very happy to be here, and of course, you know, when you're at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius, which is the same, all the climate skeptics are out there saying, where's the global warming that everyone promised? So, but all jokes aside, what we want to do on this panel today is to take a really broad look at how we're going to shelter, clothe, and nourish 10 billion people on this planet in less than 30 years, and do it within the context of all the climate change challenges. So that's really what we are set out to do. Hopefully we can cast some light on that. Very proud to be part of this group. Lot of distinguished professionals to discuss the subject of sustainable growth in the context of emerging markets and resource constraints. And you know, the nexus of food, energy, and water has been in the news quite a bit in the past decade. And I personally look at it and say, oh, FEW, phew, that sounds too dire. So I like to think of it as the nexus of nutrition, energy, and water. So they kind of revives it and say, we can say, call it new instead of few. But really what we are focused on, since there is a panel of experts who are going to talk about the energy subject in the next sustainability panel tomorrow, we swapped energy out and we said, let's focus on another strong attribute of sustainable communities and societies, which is public health or hygiene. So basically, bottom line, it's all a wash. It's about water, sanitation, and hygiene. The common thread through all of this is water, whether it is growing food and processing food, or whether it is other aspects of energy production, everything. So we really want to focus on the water aspects, and that's what this panel would try to do. For now, I'll stay with this. The second half about the water wars, maybe we'll get to it. That wasn't the title of the panel session, but it's something particularly significant for the geography in South Asia. So I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists here. Dr. Anu Ramaswamy, Chair, Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the University of Minnesota. I call her the academic guru on sustainable urban infrastructure and services. We will tap into her expertise and hear about this exciting NSF-funded project that she's working on, where she has taken the lessons learned from Sustainable Cities work in Colorado and applying them, and other cities in the West, and applying them and actually adapting them to designing sustainable cities in China and India. Dr. Vidal Garza Cantu, Founding Director of the FEMSA Foundation, the social investment instrument of FEMSA, which is a leading consumer products company in Latin America, which also happens to be the largest Coca-Cola bottler in the world. I met Vidal when he received the C.K. Prahlad Award for Global Sustainability Leadership given by the Corporate Eco Forum last year. I cannot think of anyone better to help us understand why a well-functioning ecosystem and public-private partnership is a business and economic imperative. Ramesh Vangal, chairman of the Ketra Group, which networks with over 10,000 farmers in India. Ramesh has a long and successful track record in the private sector as a manager and an executive at Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo, and Seagram. We will tap into his experience to hear what the private sector can do to enable sustainable growth in emerging markets. Manas Satpathy, executive director of Pradhan, a prominent nonprofit promoting rural livelihoods in central India. Manas has been tackling water issues in the context of sustainable agriculture. I feel really good when I read that the Gates Foundation is a big supporter of Manas and Pradhan, because just from a stake of about 15% in Ecolab, Bill Gates' net worth went up by almost $1 billion last year. So I think we are indirectly contributing to the work that you're doing in India, Manas. Let me explain the panel format a little bit. We'll have brief opening statements, not more than 5 minutes from each one of the panelists, and then I'll follow up with some moderated questions for 30 minutes. The moderated questions might be targeted at specific panelists, but hopefully we'll have that time and opportunity for other panelists to jump in and chime in. I'll also have some common questions that all the panelists will address, and then we'll get to audience Q&A. We'll have 15 minutes for that. You can pass your questions. I understand the app said you can email the questions, but I don't know where it will go because I don't have a way to receive them, so there'll be someone who will be passing chits so you can get them to us. Following this, we'll go to a brief 3-minute each round of closing statements and wrap up. Okay, so Anu, you get to start with your opening statement on this subject.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel and for bringing me here. This is actually my first Pan-IIT meeting. I am an IIT Madras 1987 chemical engineer. So I think I only wanted to hit upon 2 points. If we look at human activities, there are about 6 or 7 infrastructure sectors that are really key, and that's of course energy supply, water supply, sanitation, transportation, food systems, and land use that go together. And these few infrastructure sectors actually are responsible for almost all the health impacts. So the Global Burden of Disease study has shown about 12 million deaths annually. And these few infrastructures really take care of all those mortality and morbidity events. And then these few infrastructure sectors are responsible for more than 95% of global greenhouse gas emissions, if you look at them globally, and almost 95% of water withdrawals, because you need water for agriculture, water for electricity, water for industry, and water for domestic purposes. And so our focus has been on making infrastructure sustainable as a pathway for making a sustainable society. And in that context, I look at cities. And so the second point I wanted to make about cities is the challenge of cities is that they're smaller than these infrastructure systems. So to give an example, food travels 1,200 miles in the US. A city is less than 100 miles. Electricity travels more than 200 miles, and a city is less than 100 miles. And, freight travels 600 miles in the US, and a city is much smaller than the freight network. So if we want to understand cities in the context of sustainability, these supply chains are really important, both for cities to survive as well as the businesses in cities to survive during disasters, climate events. Many of you, I think, are familiar. We had a big power outage in Delhi because of a combination of coal and water supply shortages in 2012 in summer. And so in sum, these interactions are important, the interactions between infrastructures, cross infrastructures, between the environment and infrastructure supply chains, and between people and infrastructures, especially in the context of health. And so the big message is you need to think of multiple infrastructures, multiple resources, water, energy, materials, multiple pollution streams, and different types of actors who can act together, the public sector, the private sector, communities who can come together, and academics, I shouldn't forget us, who can come together in a solutions-oriented approach, and so that people, infrastructure, and environment nexus can solve some of these issues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vidal.
Thank you very much. Is it clear? Sounds? Very good. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Arun, for the invitation, and Raj. For me also, it's the first time to be here in this conference, and I'm really impressed with the social capital that is being built and brought together in this. If the future can be saved, definitely this is the place where you can find the solutions. And I would like to link to the message before about collaboration. My two principal notes I would like to say today is that in the terms of the topic today, water, food, and health, the interlinkages can be solved only if we can work together and if we can work in a collaborative fashion. Probably those three topics are the most urgent and most important to address today. However, sometimes we have been neglecting those because they are very simple, at least on a perspective physically, if you wish. But water scarcity affects more than 40% of the planet today, and the UN has estimated that more than 2/3 of the global population could suffer impact of water scarcity in the next 15 years. This is present. This is not the future. All three, water, food, and health, are very related to each other. Louder. Sorry. As I was saying, all those three are intimately related to each other, and with the lack of one, affecting the others to drastically change the quality of life of entire communities. In the case of water, it's a unique resource. It is precious, but it is undervalued in many areas of the world. It is irreplaceable, but in some places wasted. It is abundant, but scarce. It is a source of life, but also could be a force of destruction, as you witnessed, for example, in New York 1 year ago with Sandy. Water is essential not only for human ability to survive, but also to prosper. Its relationship with health has been documented and studied several times. As we heard in the introduction, but putting it in specific numbers, every day 6,000 children die of water-related diseases, according to UNICEF. It is involved in every single productive process, as Professor was talking about a moment ago. It is an essential part of the production of energy. 20% of the world energy is hydroelectric. And food, 70% of the water, fresh water in the world, is used for agriculture. Its relationship with food was at the center of the UN International Water Day in 2012. And for my part of the world that I study and I do work, Latin America, let me just tell you that Latin America contributes with 21% of the world fruit production and over 7% of the cereal and root production and 12% of grains. Water is essential for everything, as you can imagine, and scarcity of it will definitely put in jeopardy our future. It affects nutrition, it affects progress, it affects many other variables. If we would like to work on an issue that is more relevant for our present and our future, it should be to make a water-secure world urgent public policy matter for all governments, for all academic endeavors, and also for all society. Private sector has doing a job, and for us in FEMSA Foundation, one of the things that we have lined up is to say that if we can find ways, if we can produce mechanisms of collaboration between public, private, academic, and the social society, we can definitely find ways to measure that effort and produce results. We have done that. We have done it with some examples. We have begun a dialogue between, for example, the water users in a city with the water producers, if you wish, on the upper part of the watersheds. We call these financial mechanisms water funds, and I will probably talk of that a little bit later, if you may.
Thank you. Ramesh?
Well, we all know that water is a problem, so is everything else. I'm going to give you a simple message. It's a function of sustainability, it's a function of survival. For example, when I first went to the US, people said, "What's your name?" I said, "My name is V.V. Ramesh." They said, "What? What's your surname?" A lot of confusion. So finally I hit it. Ramesh Vaikuntanathan Vangal. Then the guy said, "Same to you." So, so I dropped the Vaikuntanathan and I became Ramesh Vangal. So the message is very straightforward. In business, you got to put pressure. And that pressure I was under because when PepsiCo entered India, and I was in a sense, the founder president or the founder of Pepsi in India, it was a bad word. Foreign direct investment was $30 million total, not billion, million. And out of that 30 million, we were bringing in a significant, maybe 15, 20% of that. So the key question was, what are you doing good for the country? So we determined that we would help in two areas. We would help in agriculture and we would help in exports. The basic challenge at that time was that the Punjab, which is the granary of India, was losing its fertility because of the hard pan, which was a hard crust which was basically because of overutilization and over-fertilization to deliver paddy and wheat. So this cycle, we had to kind of find a way of breaking into it. And that was a big problem. So we basically started a simple process called deep chiseling, which is breaking through the hard crust, which has helped a great deal. So that was one idea of soil rotation. Later on, it was very clear that we needed to do something on water because Pepsi, as it grew, is going to use a lot of water. In fact, recently, Coca-Cola was prevented from operating in Kerala because it was using far more of the water resources than it should have. Going back in time, what we did was we kind of changed the rules a little bit. And Pepsi started an enterprise. This was based on survival because we had an eminently hostile opponent who would be determined to break us down. So we did two things. First, we try to work in terms of water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, in terms of the plant and around it. That has so far delivered about 500 million liters of water conservation. Now, if I look at the total context of Pepsi using, say, 7 billion liters of water, 500 million doesn't do very much. So the next thing we said, how do we work with the different communities where we're operating? And when you operate with these communities, we began to figure out, yes, we got about 2.5 billion liters of water by community practices, workshops, storage. That goes up to a particular point. But if you look at it in the context of where India was, both these were drops in the ocean because you were doing about 2.5 million, which was nowhere near what it was needed to be able to get to this, at least the 7 billion liters. And that's when our experience with farming, because we had introduced a very large farm venture in the Punjab, but later it expanded elsewhere. We started drip irrigation. But drip irrigation in itself is not that effective in terms of the crisis that we had of ensuring that we were able to close the water recharge gap. So that was when the whole idea of direct seeding, and this is a big idea. If you do direct seeding of paddy, you save 1 million liters per acre. Now, if you look at India, India is not short of water. You have 165 million hectares, which has an average of 40 inches of rainfall a year. We have more arable land than China. So what's the problem? The problem is we're not recharging. So one simple experiment, which we pushed, was the direct seeding of paddy, which is movement out from the traditional paddy system by basically not going through a flooded field, but doing direct seeding of paddy, and it's a fairly simple process. If you save 1 million liters per hectare, that delivered the 12 billion liter saving, which has basically made PepsiCo twice as effective, meaning it delivers 2 times or recharges twice the amount of water that it uses. So my simple message is put pressure on environment, on the system to be able to deliver profitability, to provide incentive if they deliver business results in the context of sustainability. And I think that will work every time. So it's the same way that I changed my name, you need to ensure that whatever happened in terms of a corporation coming in needs to deliver the same objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. Manas?
Yes. Good afternoon. Let me start with this statement that many economists believe that sustainable development is an oxymoron. I don't believe it. Being a technocrat, I want to take the challenge. But then,
You probably have to move the mic closer.
this one? Yes? So, just to understand the magnitude of challenge, I mentioned this statement. So, based on my experience of working in the villages in India, in the poorest region of India, I can say that when it is addressed only with techno-managerial solutions, we really cannot meet the challenge. The techno-managerial solutions have to be coupled with triggering the desire in the community, not only to absorb the technology, but also to own the technology. Any technology, when it is used, we also need to understand its limitation and do sufficient so that the damage it brings to the environment, to the natural resources, how simultaneously it can be replenished. And this has to be the behavior of the people. And to make it their behavior, there has to be investment in the people to adopt those behaviors. Without that, it's very difficult to achieve sustainable development. Having said this, I would like to talk about the Indian context, which Ramesh threw some light on it. That India government spends around $17 billion a year for developing natural resources. It has enough natural resources, as Ramesh said, to feed people of India till 2050, assuming the present growth of population. It has enough water, if not everywhere, but at least in the area where food security is a problem. There are enough water because they have not yet used it for food production. Wherever they have used it, it is water stressed, but they have achieved food sufficiency. So there is enough arable land, enough water, enough investment. Why then people there are hungry? Around 300 billion people living in such area where rainfall is high, productivity is 1/3 of the national average, and investments are so high. If you know this employment guarantee scheme kind of thing, which guarantees 100 days of employment to create such water harvesting assets, all these are there. Food provisioning is there under public distribution system, and recently there is a Food Guarantee Act, which again will be investing $17 billion a year to ensure food sufficiency. Having all this in place, why people are going hungry? The basic reason, as Dr. Amartya Sen has also raised, and we have experienced it, that poverty is not because of income deprivation, it is because of capability deprivation. So investment has to be there in enhancing the capability of people. And when I say capability, it is about their ability or sense of ability to influence things. It is very low. And it is low because the poor communities of India, mainly the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, they have experienced exclusion, both social and political, for generations. They have a very low self-view. They think they cannot do many things. They cannot understand new technologies. They cannot use these technologies. So unless this apostrophe and T is removed, it is very difficult to address sustainable development or even food security of these people through techno-managerial solutions. This is what our experience is. And our experience suggests when we invest in these people, we actually organize the women who are at the intersection of most of the discriminations from these poor families to take the lead for this, bringing about this development. And they have done wonders. We have worked so far with 3 lakh families in the poorest regions of the country. 50% of them have achieved food sufficiency. It is studied by other institutions, other developmental institutions, and they have said. And these women's groups not only have achieved food sufficiency, they have taken lead to ensure a better life for all their members in the village by accessing government services, by demanding what is their need, and also working on the water management in all these areas to improve water security as well as food security for the families. So what I would like to emphasize is that these human processual skills have to be incorporated by the technocrats to really make a difference and to make development sustainable. So where do we get these people? This is actually the key offering of Pradhan. Pradhan believes that such people are critical for bringing about sustainable development, who both have the knowledge and also have the intent and the empathetic engagement that they have with the people. So that brings out the difference. And we really do not, no institution today prepares people to work in the villages. So there has to be public-spirited institution with the efficiency of the private sector to really build such people and create opportunity for them to engage in the poorest pockets of the country to bring about sustainable development, food security, and water security for these families. So that, with that, I will like to end
Thank
my...
you. Thank you, Manas. If you look at the common thread and what I'm hearing from everyone here is, I guess when we get to the energy and life sciences panels, we'll hear a lot about technological innovation, but here most of us are talking about sociological innovation, whether it is corporate social responsibility, corporate philanthropy, partnership, or government and private sector policies that will affect, focus on the least fortunate. I will throw my 2 cents in to wrap up the initial discussion, just to give you my perspective. I work for Ecolab. Ecolab as a company, we are focused on clean water, healthy environments, primarily in the cleaning and sanitation business, and focused on water as a vehicle to deliver the cleaning and sanitation. We cannot clean anything without water. And also focused on energy transfer, primarily in the industrial sector, whether it is electric power generation, paper making, mining, metals processing, aluminum, iron and steel, automobile manufacturing, everywhere. You need to either heat or cool water. And that's because that is still the most abundant way we transfer energy, whether it is heating or cooling. And because of that, we are very much conscious of the situation that most of our customers are in. We don't make consumer products. We are a B2B organization. And we have iron and steel plants, pulp and paper mills, food processing facilities in India, China, in the southwestern US that have been designed to be state-of-the-art efficient plants that do not have the license to operate and open their doors because water is the bottleneck. And that is the reality, and that's the reality today. And it is only going to get worse if you look at all the modeling in terms of water deficit that we're going to face. And there's another interesting challenge in terms of the geography and distribution of vulnerabilities. If you look at most of the climate change models, it's very interesting to see that agricultural productivity in India, in China, in parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is going to drop. And agricultural productivity in Canada and in western US is going to go up. So talk about inequality in distribution of resources and wealth. Climate change is only going to make that situation worse. So in terms of where most of the global population growth is going to be, most of the upliftment of quality of life is going to be, it's going to be in Asia. In terms of where most of the resource constraints are going to become even more challenging, it's also going to be in Asia. So we, as a business, for sustainable growth of our business and our customers' business, we don't see any way out but to solve the problem. And at the crux of this whole thing is how many of these natural resources are being valued. So we'll address some of that in some of the questions. So Anu, I think I'm going to start with you. In listening to a lot of your talks, one of the things that jumped out that I heard, I think I will paraphrase you, but you said something to the effect that cities cannot green themselves by pushing brown activities outside their boundaries. There is a lot of embedded environmental impact and resource consumption in practically everything, every product and service that's used in a city. So how, as the public sector, how do cities engage with their supply chain to make them greener?
Thanks. So I think most of you would agree, right? Food, water, energy, and shelter are sort of the core functionality that cities provide to its residents. And if you look at a city, I know of very few cities, Shanghai probably the highest, but very few cities produce even as much as 2 or 3% of their food. So food supply chains to cities is very important. In many cities in Asia, there's a lot of milk production. You know, there's a lot of cattle within the boundary, there's a lot of milk and a little bit of livestock. But if you look at all your food supply chains, they come from somewhere else. And so for cities to understand what their food shed is, how they're vulnerable to climate issues, it's important that they understand that. In terms of carbon accounting, this has come up because a lot of people measure energy use within a city boundary. But again, most cities get electricity from outside, cement from outside, petroleum from outside. During the Beijing Olympics, Beijing cleaned up its air quality by putting everything outside. And you know, some cities say there's zero carbon, and we say, how is that possible? Well, there's nothing inside the boundary. And then it also depends on what activities are happening in a city. If you're a very industrial city, many cities in India and China are growing because they're producing goods. But they're producing goods for other people to consume. And so when they're producing so many goods and services, you end up having a high energy use, but you're also exporting goods to other people. And so I just wanted to bring up this idea of production and consumption, that cities are producers as well as consumers. And they're also big users of these 7 key infrastructure sectors. So what we've started doing is encouraging cities to look at themselves as their consumer. So you can look at your households and see what is the full supply chain of everything your household is getting. And this gets at lifestyles. You know, as we become more affluent, is there a way for India and China to tell a different story? I mean, this is my biggest mission. Why are we following the Western California garden model in Bangalore? Why can't we have a different story of what a good life means? And a good life doesn't always have to mean, you know, more stuff. And we knew the story, and I think we've forgotten it. So a consumption-based footprint tells you what you are consuming as a household. A production-based footprint tells you what Shanghai is producing as a production center that other people may be using. So it gives you 2 different ways of thinking of the city. And the third way is we've developed infrastructure supply chains, which tell you how cities can plan their core functions: water supply, energy supply, food supply, construction materials. Most of your construction materials come from outside. And if you look at these footprints, it tells you different stories about also how you can intervene and make the supply chain more sustainable, and at the same time, you can also reduce your impact. So I don't know if I
It's fascinating to hear you say that about consumption-based accounting, right? And if you look at it on a global scale, in the whole climate change debate, it's the same thing. The 2013 carbon budget was just released, and a very interesting thing jumps out. After Kyoto Protocol commitments, the reductions that have been achieved in Europe, in North America and Europe, in greenhouse gas emissions are less than the greenhouse gas emissions in emerging markets that are associated with products that are produced and shipped to North America and Europe. So basically, at a national level, they've done the same thing that some of these green cities you're talking about have done. They've achieved, we in the West have achieved a reduction in our greenhouse gas footprint by shipping the production overseas. So from a consumption modeling and the very detailed consumption accounting that's been done on greenhouse gas at the national level shows that the West has not achieved any reduction in greenhouse gas if you account for actual consumption and transfer those production footprints back to the West. So transitioning to you, Vidal, You have a strong academic background in public policy, although the last few years you've been a leader in corporate philanthropy and foundation private sector activities. What kind of policies do you think are needed, or what kind of corporate governance practices are needed to promote public-private partnership, particularly in emerging markets and resource-stressed regions? Can you give us some good examples that will inspire us?
The first one I can do, the second I don't know if I can inspire you, but I will try. Following with Professor Anu, I think it's a good way of placing the importance of collaboration in terms of a market. Although my note of advice is that markets do not behave as physical science. So there is a lot of things that go around that, and sometimes they are unpredictable. But with that perspective of supply and demand, we can actually look at nature in a different manner and bring collaboration together, and then making or enabling public policies that will allow them to do. I'm really a fan of freedom, and I think society needs to regulate itself with information, with better information, and that we can do. We can try to help them do that. I don't like public policies that inhabilitate innovation or freedom or that kind of stuff. What I really think is that if we can get the information correct, we can actually move lots of things. Let me put you an example. In Latin America, there are a lot of watersheds that are overexploited. We know it, but people trying to forget about it. No? Well, how much is this watershed overexploited? Well, it's 120% overexploited. What does that mean? Do I have to pull my well 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet to bring water with arsenic and clean it, and that's it? What is the problem itself? Well, the problem itself is that the watershed is not healthy. And it has not been healthy because human beings and our activities have been deployed in it. We need to recognize that the only way to have cities, or in that sense, communities that are healthy, is if their watersheds are healthy. Thanks to research and thanks to scientific community, we know now how a watershed can be affected and how a watershed can be recovered. The answer to that is investment. Unfortunately, we always forget green investment. We always think about nature as something that will always be there, and we will not stop breathing one day because air has gone. What we need to think about is that this new information about watershed, for example, as I put it in, we need to have it very clear, and we need to have the correct amount of science put into the watershed in terms of investment. For example, some watersheds will require strong reforestation, others will require fencing to get animals out of some of the parts where the water is to be infiltrated. In other places, we need to change ways of production. In others, we will need to repair soil to make it more possible. In the case of my hometown, Monterrey, what we discovered is that our watershed is 80% degraded. And in order to reconvene that watershed, in order to get a viable city of 4.5 million people for the next century, we need to invest over $1.5 billion in the watershed. But not in 1 year. We can invest that in 50 or 60 or probably 80 years. Nature requires attention from human beings. And that attention has to be scientifically proven in order to convince private sector, convince governments, and convince societies that one tree planted in the appropriate way and in the appropriate place can infiltrate much water, as Ramesh was talking about in the case of India. Yes, that is true. And it doesn't require different kinds. You have to understand that there are trees that do better jobs than other trees. And you have to have the plants that require that watershed, not others. So what we did in Monterrey is we began raising that awareness. And in 8 months, we were able to fund $5.5 million of seed money for the Monterrey Water Fund. This Monterrey Water Fund is starting in January with an intervention of about 4,000 hectares of work that is going to be geo-referentiated how many trees, where, how many soil reparation we need to do, what exactly we need to do with some of the cattle growers there. And actually, it has to be a win solution for them. The cattle growers need to win and get more resources out of the watershed by doing better practice. And this is a long-term investment. We cannot convince them. We have to fight some of the problems of culture, perhaps, or tradition. But we need to do it. Nature is demanding right now, and particularly in our example that I'm talking about, watersheds, is demanding from human beings attention. And that attention and that flow of resources can be, and it should be recognized by the rest of society. What we have shown with the water funds across Latin America is that it is possible, and that is feasible, and that is working. And our now, I would call it, goal, and I was hearing the president of the University of Houston talking about never change your goals. I totally agree with her in the launch. Our goal is to actually get to 50 million people in Latin America in the next 15 years with investments in water funds that will be constant, permanent, scientifically proven, and then measurable results on sediment, on the amount of water infiltrated, on the amount of water preventing deterioration of soil, of the amount of land that can be used appropriately, and the amount of society in cities living happily.
Yeah, and the amazing thing, Vidal, is what you're talking about here is the private sector investing in social and environmental infrastructure. And that definitely, I keep going back to the example of India. The Global Water Intelligence Market Report tracks the amount of money that different regions of the world spend, and if you, on water and wastewater and what they charge. And the reality is, in North America, Australia, New Zealand, places like Singapore, Western Europe, they spend about $1.02 for every on wastewater treatment for every dollar they spend on water treatment, which kind of makes sense, right? Drinking water, clean water should be easier to clean than dirty water. In India, 10 cents is the expenditure on wastewater treatment relative to every dollar that's spent on water treatment. What is it telling you? It's telling you that nature is going to suffer in the long run. Yeah. The reality is, if the private sector doesn't step in, and the encouraging thing is companies, I worked with major multinationals, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Unilever, PepsiCo, they've all made strong commitments that we're not going to chase local regulations for compliance. We have corporate standards for wastewater treatment. We have corporate standards for waste management and disposal. And those are going to be applied. We are going to put our best foot forward, whether it is in Odisha, India, or Shanghai, or anywhere else in the world. And if we outsource our manufacturing to bottlers who have franchisees, we will make sure that their franchise will never get renewed if they do not sign on to our corporate standards that are global standards. And that is where the private sector can actually step in and do what the public sector either cannot afford to do or is not willing to do. So Ramesh, we'll switch tracks from water. You gave some great examples on the water stewardship work that you were able to achieve in India with PepsiCo. Let's talk about food. Globally, about a third of the food that's grown never gets consumed by humans. In the US, 40% of the food that's grown is wasted. Most of that wastage in the US and in Europe is post-retail. It's either the grocery store saying it doesn't look good anymore, we'll throw it away, or it's stuff that people cook, process at home, or eat and get served in restaurants way more than they can consume, so it gets thrown away. That's a behavioral issue. You go to a place like India. India grows about 3 times the food that gets consumed. It is not a behavioral issue. Most of that wastage happens between the farm and the retail. It's happening because of lack of infrastructure, lack of clean water, lack of refrigeration, lack of warehousing. Can you address the issue of how those aspects of food security can be addressed by the private sector?
You know, I think that was a fascinating sequence. In any emerging market, and India is no exception, policy is based on great intentions. But the policy means squat because of corruption, graft, greed. So execution is pathetic. The fundamental issue is, if you think by beating the system, I'm going to line my pockets, and then your entire ethos becomes one of trying to align your your pockets, then nothing happens. So it's really two things, profit and purpose. The key in my view, and I've had some exposure in practical terms, because most of what I tell you will be something coming from my own experience. You have to make corporations believe that purpose comes ahead of profit. Or if you deliver purpose, profit will come automatically. How does it happen? I'll give you an example. In the case of Pepsi, I gave you an example because Pepsi was very scared that if it did not deliver government objectives of being nationally good, of delivering the national good, it would be thrown out, so it delivered. I'll give you another very practical example of food security. We basically, as my company, processes about 40,000 tons of marigold flowers, which we then process into either yellow color or into lutein and different carotenoids. We have a problem because a farmer wants to raise the price, and the local agricultural support system supports the raising of the price. But on the other hand, the international price remains where it is, and we are squeezed between a higher price input and a lower price, expectation. How do you solve that? So if you really go down to the core, what we did was we absorbed in our districts an understanding of saying the main problem is the farmer wants more income. That is delivered through higher yield. It's not delivered through a higher price necessarily. It's a higher yield per acre. So we went and petitioned, got a bunch of farmers, about 500 panchayats, to go and say, these are village councils, to go and say, okay, I want so much of money per acre. And then we work through a system of practices by which you increase the yield. And when you deliver a higher yield, you're benefiting both. You're increasing your profit margin because from the same acre, instead of getting, say, 3 tons an acre, you're getting up to 8 tons an acre. So his average, for us, the average price per ton reduces. The return to the farmer is higher. The local governments are happy, the panchayats are happy, and we're meeting every possible objective. But the only way that happens is because you have to make it happen. How do you make it happen? So we, believe it or not, shot a film. We made a film like, we involved the local villagers and made a 1.5-hour documentary, like a feature film with a classical Bollywood theme of, villain, and the villain was a bad guy, he wanted the high price. So people thought it was hilarious. At the end of the day, the message came through and they got the idea. And then it started becoming a virtuous cycle. So I think just as we began to figure out, ethics makes enormous business sense, provided you can hardwire it into your system. So that's not going to come through policy. I think the problem with government of India, or frankly many other emerging markets, anything which is supposed to be good is regulated. You shall be good, and you bet 95% of the guys ain't listening. So the question is whether you can actually break that down into small, digestible elements. And those small elements fit together. Because most of academia, most of government works on the principle that everybody is all, altruistic. The reality is not that way. So I would say in India, just as IPL, the cricket league, everybody wants to become a member of it, put forward competition for people to absorb different communities, be it for food or for water or for sanitation. Sanitation is a major issue. The lack of toilet in India is reducing GDP, I'm told, by 2.5%. Think about it, because of disease and so on. I'd like to break that down and try to suggest that you make this, whether it's small, medium, or large scale, make it competitive, make them absorb some of the responsibility for certain finite communities within.
Fantastic. Manas, let's stick with agriculture. Tell us what is new and transformational that's going to change the scenario in India. From rainwater harvesting, crop rotation, whatever. What are the let's leave the life sciences people to tackle the technological stuff. You tell us what's new and great in the sociological side, particularly with a progressive NGO like yours, that we can change things dramatically.
Yeah, Ajay said this capability is the major issue in making people not only use the techno-managerial solutions, but also take care of the sustainability aspect. So the innovations are mostly around engagement with this community, enhancing their sense of agency to come up with solutions that are appropriate for their context, and also to implement it in scale to address the issues of water security and food security in their village. So the innovations that they have come up with are like rainwater management, and in a way that every person has access and control over water, so that everybody's needs are met. And also, instead of going for extraction of surface and groundwater resources, which actually has been done in plains, they are taking their crops as well as they are recharging the soil for the benefit of the people in the downstream. And again, they are going for cropping practices which maximizes return per drop of water, like system of rice intensification, and going for vegetable cultivation by using drip or manual irrigation system, so that water use is less. So when innovations are co-created by the farmers, then they take care of sustainability much better than any outside technocrat giving solutions to them. So the innovations are around engagement with the community, making them own the thing rather than be the recipient of techno-managerial solutions. And then when they take charge, their solutions are really the innovations for many others to replicate. So this is what we have learned from our work.
Great. Okay, I'm going to switch to money talks. So let's switch to a dollars and cents question. This is to all of you, but you can jump in. One is municipal water subsidies. In India, only 2% of the cost of municipal water treatment is passed on to the end user. 98% is paid by the tax base. So the end user does not have any incentive to conserve municipal water in any way, shape, or form. It's not unique to India. Ireland, until last year when they privatized and created Irish Water, people did not pay a penny for drinking water. Most of the Soviet bloc, it was the same. The Baltic countries, over a period of 3 years, they switched from a completely subsidized, tax-subsidized pricing structure for municipal water to a completely market-driven, and their water use per person has dropped dramatically. Denmark has done the same thing, Scandinavian countries across the board, and every time they switch to market-based pricing, the efficiency of water use drops a lot. Anu, I think you can address that, and then I'll lay out a couple of other money-related questions, and this may be to Manas and to Ramesh. Electricity for farming in India is pretty much a given. So farmers do not pay for the electricity to pump the water, and that has created huge distortions in terms of the least water efficient agriculture sector anywhere in the world. And then Ramesh, maybe, and Vital, you might be able to tackle this. The market distortion that's driven, I read this article in the Wall Street Journal about sugar mills in India. The government sets a floor for the price that processors and factories had to pay the farmers, the suppliers. The government also steps in at the right election cycle, sets a ceiling for the price that the manufacturers can charge the consumers. And caught between this floor and ceiling is the private sector that's actually trying to make money processing and producing stuff. It's basically the asynchronous aspect of free market evolution, but it's really putting a crunch. India, the second largest sugar producer in the world, is running into a situation where sugar mills are being shut down today because of this crunch. So can we take those subjects one at a time and tackle what should be done differently that's going to change things? Go on the water stuff, Anu.
I think we could say this for everything, water and energy, but more so for water, that the full cost of supplying the infrastructure isn't passed on to the consumer, and then we have other issues where there's tapping of water or electricity, And so the sum total of all that is that the price doesn't reflect the value that people are getting. And this is also particularly true when we worked with the Hyderabad water supply and sanitation system. And people are reluctant, when they look at the price they're paying for drinking water, they're reluctant to pay more for wastewater treatment because they feel the nature can take care of it and they really don't want to pay for it. So it's not clear though that just the government can increase the price, because any time that's been tried, there's a lot of opposition to it. And so instead of taking more time, I thought I'll just talk about a very interesting scheme that's been working well in India. It's the town planning scheme that's being used in small towns for greenfield development. And this is important because these small towns are going to become the big cities. This is a good statistic. 65% of the world's future urban growth will happen in cities less than 1 million. And we actually haven't ever studied them. We always study the Mumbai, the Delhi, and the New York City.
Mexico City.
Yeah, but we never study these little cities. And so in Gujarat, they found that if you were in a greenfield area, which is a rural area that's going to become urban, instead of coming in as a government and saying we'll do eminent domain and we'll provide infrastructure, there's many of these experiments that have been tried around different cities that are saying we'll do a public-private partnership with a sort of projection on the property values, because when your house or your property comes near a highway, has water supply, has power supply, the property value, especially in India, you know this, land values are so high, the property values increase incredibly. So the World Bank has also done a study on this, and this could be a new model where the government gets out of the way of financing infrastructure. And these community and private partnerships provide the infrastructure in this new model. And I'm told through the Indian government fellows who are in our program that compared to the old way, where the government would say the road has to pass through your land, we'll give you some compensation, there have been almost 0 court cases, which tells you that both sides see that they're benefiting. And that's one way of thinking of the alternative to the current system.
Anyone want to tackle the whole issue of indirect subsidies of water through electricity to farming? Is that in the long run sustainable?
I'm happy to try. I think that it flows in the same theme that I was talking about earlier. You know, at the end of the day, as we said, corruption, graft is going to stay. The key is education. What I've found in India, that if you're able to grab hold of a community and ensure that you tell them and you're able to educate them, that actually it makes sense for them to pay for some water. It works. I'll give you an example. Take any slum in Bombay, whether it's Dharavi or whether it's Kolaba or whether it's Bandra. Huge slums. But there's a certain organization. They pay some form of informal tax. They pay something for water. And they're quite happy to get involved in terms of paying for some sanitation. So the key is education. So it's bottom up. And if you go back to what Gandhi said, very, very straightforward. Government at the base. Where we got it mixed up was in the early stages post-independence. We had a very top-down government, large projects. Instead of doing what Gandhi said was go bottom up. Because actually speaking, there are small communities in India, which are in Rajasthan, which are so conscious about preservation. They will basically attack you if you cut down a tree. And there was this famous case about the Salman Khan who shot a black buck, and he was then hauled up by the local community because he was endangering conservation. So I think we're a very smart people in every country, but in India, if you take it, you've got to explain to them what it is it's all about. And I think that works. It works in many communities I've seen in Chennai. I've seen it in many farms. It's a question of giving them the ammunition with which they go and change the rules. Because there's this myth about free power. Free power for farmers don't exist because it's not available. They may offer you free power, but it's not available for more than 4 hours a day, and it doesn't help. So you're going to have to find ways of getting power in your own manner. And the reality is very straightforward. I'll give you an example in Punjab. 1991, 93% of the water was within 10 meters of the ground. Today it's 300 meters. So you have got to find different solutions. So I think it starts at the bottom, not by regulation, not by private-public partnership, but educate the base and use private sector as catalysts for profit before purpose, or rather purpose before profit. And the profits will follow if you deliver purpose.
Three things. May I add three things? With this discussion is very interesting. First, lesson number one of economics. There's no such thing as a free something. There's some energy, some effort, some work. Something has to be done for all of us to be here. Somebody paid for this. So at the end, subsidies, as we were explaining, it has become distorted in many of the emerging countries. Subsidies is a good thing when the capability of the society is not there. So subsidies should be always temporary while you build society and their capabilities to work and to recognize, as he was saying, the value of the thing. Third message, water should be a human right. Service of water now. The service of water requires infrastructure, requires cleaning, pumping, treatment. That costs energy, costs infrastructure, costs capital. Somebody needs to recognize that. 30 years ago, we didn't need this, but we pay it every month. All of our life, we have been requiring this, and we don't recognize the value of this. It's incredible. But, I mean, we can drop this and forget about it. We can actually live without electricity, but we cannot live without one day drinking some water.
Thank you. I think we're going to switch to the audience questions. I know you had, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So just to follow up, I think this is an exciting thread. And I actually agree with the bottom up. A lot of these town planning schemes are happening at the 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer with a lot of community participation. I just worry about the word education, and it's often used by people like us who go and educate people in the villages, and actually they know a whole lot more than us. And many times they know systems and how things interact with each other, not in a scientific way, or they couldn't explain it in a scientific way, but they know it. And I think this is where the capacity is. How do we communicate this elitist, Western, scientific, reductionist way of looking at the world with people in villages and communities that actually have a holistic, and you don't have to go teach them about sustainability. We've been more sustainable than anyone else. And making that dialogue happen is, I think, the crux of getting community and then public-private together.
Collaboration.
The local knowledge, I wanted to use that word.
I think we have about 20 minutes, if we will all restrict ourselves to 1-minute closing statements here, to address some of these questions. There's some fantastic questions here. Many of them, I will first pick a couple of questions that have a common thread. One is about, it's something that's, as someone who has worked in the private sector for almost 30 years, my head said this whole idea of valuing natural capital and monetizing externalities, that we cannot wait for regulations. Regulations are but a way for public sector or governments to force externalities onto us, onto the private sector. So, in a very general statement that quite a few people have made, that forget governments, they're too dysfunctional. Of course, there's the other question a couple of people have asked about companies focused on return. So on one extreme, you have the public sector focused on 4-year election cycles. On the other extreme, you have the private sector focused on 3-month financial statement cycles. Not everyone is brave like Paul Pullman and Unilever walking away from quarterly financial statements. Where is the balance? Can you actually convince the private sector to drive things that the public sector is dysfunctional about, while they have to meet their fiduciary responsibility on a quarterly basis for the investors? That's a broad question. Anyone wants to tackle that?
That's a very tough question.
Ramesh, you're thinking.
You know, I think large companies don't adopt best practices because they have to. Look at pharma, look at energy, look at oil. It's all about large companies, a large-scale greed. The only way you make that happen, I think, is to be able to break that down into the small elements and ensure that they are, in a sense, competing against each other for scarcer resources and visibility. You look at the whole concept of CSR. Everybody wants their name in the papers. I did this, and I have helped so many villages, communities. So my recommendation is, having worked for large companies, having worked for a small one, and today I'm owned by a charitable foundation which I set up. I'm very clear in my objectives. I can tell you that at the end of the day, what makes sense is to be able to ensure not education in the sense of a diktat, but more in building awareness amongst the smaller communities that ethics makes business sense. And I'm 100% confident that works every time, everywhere. If you make people the owners of their destiny, they will deliver. I don't think forced public-private partnerships work, because typically the private partnership will try to get the majority of the cake and deprive the public from the balance.
Okay, I'll follow up with another question here that one of the other panelists can tackle. This is, in the US, corporations do quite a bit of socioeconomic work. Why Indian companies like Reliance, Birla, Tata, or rich individuals cannot do it? It's an interesting statistic. If you, again, it goes back to one of the things that Ramesh pointed out, that government tries to mandate goodness. It was interesting, the Indian Parliament actually passed a law about corporations beyond a certain size setting aside a certain percentage, fixed percentage of their money for social responsibility activities, and actually mandating reporting too, in terms of transparency and social and sustainability reporting. And clearly that is not going to take the place of voluntary, unless companies recognize that the social infrastructure and the environmental infrastructure is critical and essential for their long-term survival and invest in it. These kinds of government requirements, people are always going to find a way around it. That's at least my thought. Anyone else? Anu, you had some thoughts to share here?
I just want to make sure we just don't bash government and go home happy, thinking corporations will take care of everything, because we do need governments fundamentally to establish property rights. If you don't have property rights, you don't have a free market. So let's give government that. And a lot of your trouble with countries where things don't function is because property rights aren't properly enforced. So that's fundamental. You need government if you have market externalities. So a lot of issues we're talking about with health concerns, inequities, they're not going to be just addressed by corporations unless there's some public pressure and some government involvement. Long-term pollution issues and infrastructure issues which have a long-term funding horizon, they all need government. So I don't think we should be shy about saying when government is needed, but probably a dysfunctioning government doesn't help anyone. But for the most part, government does important things in those 4 areas. You couldn't have businesses without property rights. You need government to establish where market failure is happening. And infrastructure is those extreme cases of monopoly. Infrastructure is not an open free market. So you need to have some government either in setting up level playing fields, setting up the right rules. So you can't just wave away government. I just wanted to say that.
Definitely appreciate that. I'm going to switch to a question. Actually, this reflects the fact that 98% of the water on this water planet is salt water. There's about a dozen questions here about desalination as being the magic bullet, and about is there some whiz-bang technological transformation that's going to happen that's going to make this water issue go away.
We have the energy to do that, and we can disperse and use it to actually desal water like that. Maybe it will be a solution, but then you need pumps, you will need pipes, you will need lots of other things. I think the correct way to put it, in Mexico we have a saying, and I'm trying to go back a little bit of what you said before, Arun. When you want something not to be done, you ask the government to do a decree. I don't know if it's applicable to India, but I mean, honestly, oh, there is a decree of the president, forget it. I mean, they will find a way out. And I think that the important thing of the correct, I would say balance between public and private and society and the academics and probably all the actors is the sense of collaboration or the sense of trying to collaborate. And this nexus of water, health, and food requires collaboration. But we need to fight lots of things that fight or that are against us. Professor Jim Austin, one of my mentors in Harvard Business School, we came out with a list of collaborative guidelines that I would like to just mention, if that's okay. Are 10. I will just mention them very quickly. The beauty of the list is that they all start with a C. The first of things for collaboration is that you need clarity of purpose. If the different parts of the society don't understand what you're trying to do, you don't have it placed, very clearly, it will not be easy to get the collaboration. So clarity of purpose. Then you need to connect that purpose, that public value purpose with people. Connection between that purpose and people. Third, you need complementary resources. You cannot do it alone, government alone, society alone, private sector alone, forget it. Complementary resources, number 3. Number 4, you need a collaborative value mindset. And that's not easy to get in developing countries. We tend to fight. We actually, when we play soccer, we always are angry with another country that beat us. We don't have that mindset. So we need to fight against that collaborative value mindset to have it. Number 5, you need communication, very appropriate communication between the parts inside the private, the government, the society, and outside. You need creating trust every single day. Trust is an inverted pyramid. You cannot trust and then forget for 1 year that person or that contact. You need to build and construct and create that trust every single day. Number 7, you have to have regulation, but you have to have constructive regulation. That's what we need to teach the government to do. The government needs to do regulation that has to be constructive, not destructive. Number 9, you have to be flexible, so creating or creative problem solving. You have to always think that sometimes the road will change, so we need to be flexible enough to be creative enough for the problem solving. And at the end, probably the most important for any collaboration is we need that all the parts have a true commitment to this partnership. Not, I'm going to run election and say you tomorrow, or the company third quarter report, and that's it, the final end, I don't care. You have to have a commitment that shows society that you're really pursuing public value in your actions. No? So.
Thank you, Vidal. There are 3 questions that were specifically for particular panelists, and 2 of them were actually addressed to you, Manas, and it specifically says, tell us about Pradhan and what Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation's involvement is. 2 people asked the same question.
So Pradhan is a 30-year-old organization founded on the belief that key to bring about change is about engaging people with head and heart, basically knowledgeable people with empathy with the poorest, brightest with the poorest. So with this belief, Pradhan was founded, and it so far continued bringing in educated people from reputed institutions in India to directly work with the poorest in the country. Basically, we work in the Central India region where 70% of the scheduled tribe population of the country lives. So I was talking about them, that any amount of subsidies, provisions, investments, just bypass them. They are not able to absorb those because the belief that they have about themselves is that they cannot do many things, and people who deal with them also believe that they cannot do anything. I can share with you one example, just small example to say, in one of the training programs that we had organized for SHG women, agriculture training programs, because women do most of the agricultural operations, so we invest on them to better adopt the technologies. The government officer who is there immediately got upset with us, saying, "Are you playing with me? Where are the trainees?" We said, "The women are sitting there, they are the trainees. Are you joking with me? Women are supposed to be trained by me." He just went back to the office. He didn't train. But today's situation has changed. He is constantly in touch with these SSG women to train them. So this is where it is. People don't have belief on them, and at the same time, others also have a belief that they can't do much.
So is it really the education and training aspect that attracted the Gates Foundation to fund
This
some
has
of
to
your work?
change. So Bill Gates support basically is that they actually started supporting us in 2009. They understood that the inclusive growth can be brought about only by investing in agriculture, because 50% of the population still directly depend on agriculture. So based on the work that we did in the first 3 years of our association, now to upscale those innovations of sustainable agriculture, they have supported us to take it to 3.5 lakh family, 350,000 families in the poorest states like Odisha, Bihar, and Jharkhand. So the focus is not only to upscale the lessons that we have learned in the first phase to these many families, but also to collaborate with mainstream programs, government programs, which covers millions of families, to exchange knowledge, experience, and also influence their practices so that large number of families benefit out of these innovations, lessons that we have.
Fascinating. Keep in mind, we're going to, most of us are going to be around the entire weekend, so I know there's a stack of questions here that I'm actually going to save because they are fantastic questions. I'm going to share it with the panelists so they can ruminate over it and maybe even get back to some of you, but definitely tackle us out in the lobby. There's one question here that I'm going to tackle, and then we'll go to closing statements. It says, is business really truly willing to pay for the economic costs, true cost of water and energy and everything else? Resources both in emerging economies and in mature economies, or are they trying to exploit the low cost that is currently provided by the public sector? I will address this. There is a trend that is gathering steam. Natural capital accounting or true value accounting or triple bottom line accounting is going beyond some of the very visible reputational risk type companies like Puma and Nike. There are big industrial entities with large footprints in water, energy, and forestry resources that have actually made very formal and very public commitments to accounting for natural capital and investing in natural capital. Last week there was a conference held in Edinburgh where many of the major multinational corporations made strong statements in this area. The World Economic Forum is actually considering that in 2014 they're going to have what is called a Global Agenda Council around natural capital accounting. Many companies have started doing true value accounting for water within their own operations. It's an area that we're involved in actually developing the tools for many of our customers, particularly the heavy industry. So it is going beyond branding, green branding, and consumer products. It is going to companies that are behind the scenes that you don't hear about, and they're actually starting to do true value accounting. So what's going to happen is companies are going to make decisions based on water costing $10 a cubic meter, even though they're only paying, for example, in India, 10 cents a cubic meter, or in the US, $1 a cubic meter. So that is happening, and hopefully that's going to gather steam. So I think we're going to switch to closing statements here, and after we hear the rest of the panelists, I will add some closing thoughts. Manas, we'll start with you.
Yeah,
2 minutes.
The key message that I would like to give is that we are talking about partnership of public and private organizations, but they can be made more accountable only when citizens are helped to occupy the space available to them. So that also should be the key focus for enhancing citizens' capability to occupy their space.
My question to you, smart guys, IIT, We need game changers. This phone is a game changer. 20 years ago in India, when you made a lightning call which you got after 6 years, you had to speak so loudly you didn't even need the phone. The voice would carry directly. This is now from 1.5 million phones, landlines in 1990. We have 800 million of these fellas floating around. So my question, if you look at food and water and agriculture, you look at desalination, you look at whatever, is there a game-changing capability that could change this? I'll give you one example. Today, in about 6 million farmers have access to daily prices of 200 mandis or marketplaces in India through their mobile phones. That allows the farmer to decide where he should take his tomatoes to. This was done for profit. But you have 800 million phones. My question is, the awesome power that's in the US with technology, can you direct that towards delivering very practical solutions? Because it ain't going to come from government and it ain't going to come from organized business.
They will come from IIT, I'm sure. My closing remarks will be probably on the same philosophy. Collaboration requires people. Forget public and private sector. At the end, we're talking about people, persons that are going to be clients, persons that are going to be consumers, persons that are going to be voters. So at the end, the public and the private sector, this distance that I sometimes perceive, should be down if we have the correct information provided to all of us. And I will commend, for example, that this institution, the Indian Institute of Technology, is very entrepreneurial, right? Has this quality. Well, I would like to place, again with my list of C's, letter C, some collaborative characteristics of entrepreneurs that probably IIT already teaches, but it will be interesting. I don't know if they can be taught, but I'm sure you can learn them. You have to be game changer. You have to be a champion, as he was saying. Definitely. You have to be somebody who believes in change, a champion. You have to have ability to communicate. If you're a quiet researcher or a quiet expert, forget it. This world requires communicators. You have to be a creator. You have to think outside, we like to say this in FEMSA, outside the bottle. Think outside the bottle. We're always thinking on the same thing. Think outside. Open your mind. Be more strategic. You have to have the capacity to coordinate. And coordinate means sacrifice your idea sometimes with somebody else. You have to help that ability. And you have to, at the end, be a catalyst. That means you want the thing to be done, not wait for somebody else to do it. And be sure to contribute, another C, contribute, be part of it, not just send a forward or an email and that's it. No, you have to actually write it down, make it possible. You have to be a calculator. You have to calculate what are going to be the values presented. And at the end, I come back with the word C, change agent. You have to believe yourself that if somebody's going to save this future and this present of the world, it's going to be persons.
Oh my
and
goodness,
it's going to be you.
I'm not going to play Scrabble with you. All right. Anu?
So I thought I might follow this thread and close on two things. We've talked about change making, but I don't think we've really discussed enough as a society change for what? Where do we want to go? Do we want, and India and China cannot look like the US. The US lifestyle with our seniors in senior housing and young people who never meet their grandparents frequently, I don't see that as our culture. And I think it's a good question to ask, what do we want? And one of my colleagues from Arizona State University said even all this too much electronics is changing how our kids' brains are thinking differently from our brains. Do we want a static future, right? Destructive Earth, and we're going off, making other planets destructive. What is it we want? And I don't think we've had that discussion. We've viewed development as just mostly money, and we haven't addressed some of the social, ethical, even spiritual things that we should be asking ourselves, because then you know what you're changing towards. And the second point I wanted to make is about integrative leadership. I don't think it's only government or only businesses. I think nonprofits actually we have a great example here, but they play a very big role, and the community at large. And those four things actually have very different cultures. If you're in a business culture versus a government culture versus an academic culture. So I think we need to train people, us, who can bridge multiple cultures so that you can do such integration.
Thank you. I'll wrap up with a couple of thoughts around that actually address a lot of the questions that came up about Cherrapunji. Of course, we all, from kindergarten, from preschool, we learned that the rainiest place on earth is in India. And last year I was traveling to Singapore for World Water Day, and there was an article in the New York Times about how people around Cherrapunji have to walk 5 miles to get water for their cooking water. And it has to go to infrastructure, and that's really what it is. The seasonality of water and the quality of water are the bigger challenges than the absolute quantity of water in many places in India. At that World Water Day event, I declared that the age of aqueducts is over. When Rome ran out of water, they just built aqueducts and they brought it from all over the world. When the textile mills in Manchester wanted cotton, they went and conquered India, conquered Egypt, and they grew the cotton. Those days are over, or that's what I said. It's really true. The country of Bangladesh depends on almost all its water, depending on what India is going to provide, flowing through the Ganges. Most of the water in the Brahmaputra comes from China. The Mekong Delta is a huge geopolitical issue for Southeast Asia in their relationship with China. There are massive issues, geopolitical issues, that are going to surround the availability of water, which the UN, by the way, has declared as a basic human right. And the UN Global Compact and the CEO Water Mandate and all of that are vehicles that the private sector has used to recognize that commitment. So ultimately, there are some transformational things that are going to happen. It might not be condensing rainwater, humidity from the air. It might not be desalination. But there might be other things, and this is where innovation comes in. Last year, Nike, through a venture that they funded, came up with a way to dye textiles for apparel, for shoes, without using any water. And when this was announced at the Corporate Eco Forum, I was sitting across from the Chief Technology Officer for International Paper and Alcoa. They turned to me and they said, what will happen when we figure out how to make paper without water and how to transfer heat with nanotechnology without using billions of gallons of cooling water? What will happen to your business? And I said, that is the kind of disruptive innovation, a company that survives providing services for industrial water cycle management. We better think about that, and that is going to happen, because that is where the biggest users of energy in the industrial sector are going to come up with ways to do it without water. But there are certain areas, drinking water, sanitation, food production, where we cannot take the water out. That is the sheer fact of biology. And those are the areas where we have to focus more on social and responsibility issues and less on looking for magic technological bullets. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be here. We can have discussions. I think we closed pretty close to the 90-minute time. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, Raj, Anu, Vidal, Ramesh, and Manas. This was truly an amazing panel. I hope the audience here is inspired, and we've got a lot of food for thought on how we can solve some of these big challenges. Our speakers here have flown literally from all around the world. As a token of appreciation, PanID wants to give them an award. So please join me in another warm round of applause for the speakers.